would begin arriving from the far-flung reaches of the future, having come to witness the first voyage into time. Obviously a great thing to see if you're a time traveler. It's like if you had a Cessna airplane that you could fly to Kitty Hawk in 1906, wouldn't you fly there and see? But it kept nagging at my mind that there was some paradox in this, or something was wrong with this idea. And then I said, aha, I see. What it is that it's the kill your own grandfather problem. If time travelers could travel backward into the past, even as far as only the invention of the first time machine, one of them might conceive, one from many centuries in the future, might travel back and kill their grandfather and initiate that good old paradox of how could you kill your grandfather? Because you killed your grandfather, you didn't exist, so how could you exist to kill your grandfather? That sort of thing. But then I realized, no, in the same way that the most advanced cultures on the sphere of the planet dominate and overwhelm less advanced cultures, the most advanced future states would dominate and overwhelm the entire temporal continuum clear back to the moment of the invention of the first time machine. So what you would really see when you threw the switch on the first time machine would be the simultaneous arrival of the ultimate state of human evolution, whatever that is, something beyond our conceiving. So it's in very practical terms, it would fulfill this apocalyptic dream of monotheism. It's conceivable that if we could invent a device which would transmit information or objects forward into time, that the moment that device were invented, we could call upon the resources of all future human history to bail us out of this mess that we're in. It may be the only way to save the planet. An immediate time wars commitment to spare no effort to send information forward into the future looking for help. I'm not serious, of course, but I am peculiar. On that note, why don't we take an intermission and then come back? Oh, I don't know, 10 minutes, something.
That's a lot of questions.
Oh, well. I'll take one bit first. I mean, there's a lot of separate questions. The punctuated evolution thing, the idea that evolution moves by fits and starts, which was denied by neo-Darwinists and by Darwin himself in favor of the idea of a slow, gradual, steady progression, moving at a more or less uniform rate. Darwin was a great disciple of Lyell's and the principle in geology of uniformitarianism, the idea that things go on at uniform rates. And this particular school of geology was opposed to the theory of catastrophism, the idea that there are catastrophic events on the earth, like the flood, the biblical flood, and that the development has been discontinuous. There's been breaks and fits and starts and periods of more or less stability and then big changes. That catastrophist theory, which was a popular theory at the beginning of the 19th century, was rejected by Darwin as it was rejected by Lyell, because as soon as you allowed catastrophes, all the Christians agreed with this and said, yes, the Bible tells us that. We know from our whole cultural history that there are catastrophes, and this is saying the same kind of thing. They wanted to be saying something totally different that wouldn't fit into any kind of biblical view whatsoever. The idea of a totally progressive, linear process of change. Anyway, the fossil record never supported that, and punctuated equilibrium seems to be what happens. And it suggests that evolution moves by fits and starts. And what started as an appalling heresy, it's been a recurrent heresy ever since Darwin first put forward his book, people have objected to it on the grounds that evolution may well move by fits and starts. Even T.H. Huxley disagreed with Darwin on this one. Anyway, if evolution moves by fits and starts rather than uniformly, then it looks as if there's not a uniform rate of novelty formation in the genus. And of course that's just what Terence tells us.
That's right. One way of thinking about the novelty wave on the largest level is that it is a picture of the ebb and flow of mutation in the history of life on the planet. In other words, the idea that mutation is random is based on the untested and cheerful assumption that radiation is arriving at the rate is arriving on the Earth at an even rate. But there's no reason why it should be. If the rate of radiation arriving on the Earth were fluctuating for any reason, you would expect to see a concomitant fluctuation in the fossil record. And there are many other reasons. A catastrophism, the idea that there have been extremely violent episodes in the Earth's history, huge volcanic outgassings, cometary and asteroidal impacts, and this sort of thing, is now pretty widely accepted. And in fact, the extinction of the dinosaurs is put down to an asteroidal impact. But go on. It would be interesting to hear you deal with the salts that tire.
Yes, I'm fascinated by these salts that get tired. I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to get from you later a reference to the literature so I can look it up, because that sounds really interesting. Eutectic salts going backwards and forwards and getting tired. I mean, the only thing that I'd think offhand in response to that is that I've been thinking quite a lot recently about exactly that kind of phenomenon, melting points, and asking the question of myself and of chemists that whether compounds that are fairly newly synthesized, when they're crystallized, have a particular melting point, and that as time goes on the melting point might change, because the habit which holds the crystal in its form might become stronger and it might be more resistant to thermal disruption, so the melting point might go up. It turns out that in the chemical literature, far from being fixed, melting points fluctuate. In the published literature, I've found differences of up to 12 degrees over 20 years. And there do seem to be extraordinary fluctuations, and most organic chemists agree that the strange changes occur, that they don't seem half as constant as they're cracked out to be.
Maybe we can keep the ice caps in place then.
Well, that might be
changing the melting point.
The eutectic mixture, you see, one of the things I've been thinking about is that when a substance melts, you've both got a formative field of the crystal, but the liquid phase of the substance also has a morphic field. Liquids have characteristic properties. They're not totally chaotic and formless. They have, and if it's a new substance that's never been melted before, it won't have had a sort of morphic field for its liquid phase. By repeated cooling, and I was trying to think of experiments involving cycling a substance through cycles of melting and cooling, because there would be a way in which the number of transitions and also the endurance of the liquid versus the solid phase would tend to stabilize the morphic fields of these two phases. And in a sense, around the melting point, it would be as if there were two competing fields. And if one were the stronger, it might tend to raise or lower the melting point. So this is,